And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. The Honourable Jim Prentice is a Senior Executive Vice President and Vice Chairman for CIBC. I've had the pleasure of working with Jim for the past 3 years, and he's been a tremendous partner. One of my colleagues actually referred to him as the Wayne Gretzky of investment banking. Jim is a great hockey fan, so he can address whether that's Wayne with the Oilers, the Kings, the Blues, or the Rangers. So, from 2006 to 2010, he was a senior cabinet minister. The Prime Minister referred to him as the Chief Operating Officer of the government. He went from being Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development to Minister of Industry, and then the Minister for the Environment. So I'd like to welcome Jim Prentice.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I am most assuredly not the Wayne Gretzky of investment banking. But I will tell you this, Dan Nowlan is definitely the Stevie Eiserman of Bay Street, because he is one of the most admired and respected people in the entire Canadian banking business. So thank you, Dan. I'm pleased to be here, pleased to see many old friends and familiar faces, and I'm really excited to see so many young people. It means a lot, and congratulations on taking part. It's always dangerous to acknowledge specific people in a room full of distinguished folks who've made a contribution to public life, but I want to acknowledge two people because they're my sailing buddies, Jay Hill and Chuck Strahl, both of whom are here and both who've done a lot for the Manning Center. I can tell you, whether you are in 12-foot waves in the Caribbean or at the head of sailing in the ship of state, these are the guys that you want beside you. So the only time my life was ever imperiled was eating Chuck's tuna fish casserole. So I'm going to devote my time this afternoon to a discussion of conservation and the place of the environment in our national dialogue, and also within the priorities of the conservative movement. And this is something I know a little bit about. I have been a card-carrying member of Conservative Party for 40 years. And I have been a passionate fly fisherman and an outdoors person longer than that. Before I begin, though, I want to just emphasize that the views I'm about to share are my views. They're my views alone. They are not the views of CIBC. They are personal. They're based on my years in political life. They are most assuredly not the views of the C.D. Howe Institute either. So let me begin by acknowledging that I'm following a path that is worn in part by the person, the man for whom this conference is named. Last year, and who is also, I should point out, a passionate fly fisherman. Last year, Preston gave a very thoughtful speech in British Columbia, and at that time he discussed the dearth of public support for development in the energy sector. And he spoke forcefully about the need for better integration of development and conservation and the environment. And for Preston Manning, and I think you all know this builds upon 25 years, a record of making conservation an important pillar in his political philosophy. Now, those of you who know me know that I love to read. I find that thick books are not always worth the effort, other than, of course, to emphasize for the edification of Bob Ray, who once suggested that conservatives don't read at all, that in fact we do. But a few years ago, when I was Canada's Minister of the Environment, I took it upon myself to read a book that actually challenged the structural integrity of my bedside table, a 1,000-page tome on Theodore Roosevelt, the naturalist president, the man whose crusade helped to preserve the American wilderness, helped define conservation as both a national priority and also as a moral imperative. And during his two presidential terms, at the dawn of the 20th century, working in the interests of the people whom he described as the people unborn, this man, a conservative, set aside essentially 1/10 of the landmass of the United States of America as migratory bird preserves, national monuments, national forests, and national parks. He didn't even attend the swearing in of his successor because he was holed up in the White House signing last-minute declarations to preserve untold acres of the United States as forest preserves. Amongst other accomplishments, he saved the Grand Canyon with the stroke of a pen. And taken together, it was and it remains one of the greatest achievements, an astounding achievement, towards conservation. And Roosevelt's commitment to conservation was actually rooted in patriotism, because he loved his country and he wanted to protect the wild spaces that helped define it for this generation, but also for future generations. And that ideal was actually renewed in America in the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson called for a new conservation. And in a special message to the American Congress in 1965, the President declared, and I quote, "Our conservation must be not just the classic conservation of protection and development, but a creative conservation of restoration and of innovation, and its concern must not be with nature alone, but also with the total relationship between man and the world around him." And so Johnson aspired to restore and protect the beauty of his country, both urban and rural, and to build on the legacy of Roosevelt, whose doctrine had been extended through time and across borders. And in fact, Roosevelt's doctrines, his beliefs, resonated with another conservative, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, who in 1961 hosted a conference which is well known in Canadian history, the Resources for Tomorrow Conference with Struck, which set out to strike a better balance between the development of our resources and the protection of our environment. And so all of this resonates today with a new vitality as an industrial world confronts the challenges of climate change and other threats to our natural environment. And I know it resonates in particular with young people. And conservatives have always been alive to these responsibilities. Over time, environmental concerns and action have been a hallmark of the Conservative Party. Think of the Acid Rain Treaty and the other environmental achievements of the government of Brian Mulroney, who in 2006 was actually declared, honored by an expert panel as the greenest of all of the Canadian prime ministers, a panel that incidentally included Elizabeth May, and I'll leave that for you to reflect upon. But I think also of the long history of conservation efforts in my home province of Alberta, which, as Preston has noted, in our province responded to the nascent development of the oil and gas industry by creating something called the Oil and Gas Conservation Board, not the Oil and Gas Development, a board that went on in the world of regulatory affairs to be one of the most respected institutions, certainly in North America, if not in the world. And so here too, Alberta was led, indeed Canada was led, by conservatives. And so conservation also was a critical precept in the development of the West, both in Canada and in the United States. And the dominant presence in British Columbia, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, of public lands, and the fact that in those provinces virtually all of the mineral wealth is owned by the public, are a direct product of that same ethic. And so too is the legal and the constitutional framework that we have across Western North America relating to water and access to waterways. And my point is this, that as conservatives, we have led on this issue throughout that time, and we have led with purpose and with conviction. And we should not cede this ground to others or allow ourselves to be portrayed as being indifferent to the world around us. Now, certainly there is a pick your side mentality that accompanies and prevails in debates surrounding resource development and environmental concerns. This is not a new notion. It is not a new notion that you can be on the side of development or you can be on the side of environment, but you can't be on both. This is not a new phenomenon. During his time as a senator, Preston Manning's father, Ernest, traveled to Toronto and gave a speech on energy development. He expressed the frustration at that time that it was almost impossible in Alberta to consider developing an oil and gas field or a facility without encountering what he described as vehement or even violent obstructionism. And Manning talked about the need to define what he described as an intelligent balance between demonstrated public need and legitimate environmental concerns. And that, my friends, was in 1979. And so a similar dynamic exists today. We see it perhaps most divisively in a subject I speak often about, corridor projects in British Columbia, the divisiveness surrounding pipeline debates. And we should not fall into this trap. We should not accept this dynamic. We should not view concerns for the environment as a political anathema to what we believe in as conservatives. To the contrary, I believe that leading on the environment has become a political imperative. And since I left politics, I have, I think as many of you know, spoken around the world often on the issue of Canada's energy future. And to resort to something that is at the same time both a cliche as well as an understatement, I can tell you that the world is ever more complicated. Global issues are increasingly intertwined. Security and economic development, privacy and technological innovation, development and the environment, energy and climate change. And I would say to you that focusing on environmental policy is not exclusively a question of morality. Increasingly, it is an economic imperative. Now, around the world, the wave of concern over climate change crested a number of years ago. I know that. I was at Copenhagen. I have the scars to show for it. I remember it. But those who are paying attention can see that the next wave is building again. And the wave will come. And trust me, when it crests on Canada's shore, it will be at its highest point. And so Canada needs to be ready for it, and we as Conservatives need to be ready for it. Because our position as a country is amongst the most precarious. We are an industrial democracy. We have a solid record of environmental achievement, but we are also a country with a developing economy that is heavily dependent on the extraction and development of our natural resources. And also, we have a vast resource which is unique in the world, and that is the Canadian oil sands. And so for us, standing back will not be, my friends, an alternative. And as Conservatives, we cannot be in the business of providing our political rivals with the opportunity to portray us as being out of touch with the prevailing values of Canadians and the prevailing sentiment in the global community. We must aspire to achieve what Senator Manning referred to as an intelligent balance. And so in pursuit of this balance, we will need principles to guide us. I say this firstly because principles ensure that you don't lose your own bearings in times of ongoing change and volatility. No person ever sets out to become lost, but many do. I say we need principles, secondly, because we are a respected democracy. And the rest of the world has, and the rest of the world will hold us to a high standard of transparency. We need to make clear what we believe in, and people need to see us taking action to achieve it. And finally, I say that we need principles for this reason, because quite simply, and I see this in the world in which I'm currently working, in a competitive global marketplace where countries compete as well as companies compete, we cannot afford to be cross-threaded with our existing and our potential customers. And so this is not merely a question of morality. There is a highly practical element surrounding all of this. It is about protecting our place in the global economy, about preserving jobs and investment, because we are a country, more so than any country in the G8, that relies on trade and because we are therefore a country that relies on our international reputation. And so I would say to you, to my mind, there are 8 principles that we should use as Conservatives to define Canada's approach to the environment and to conservation in the 21st century. Firstly, we must continue to develop our resources. We must extract them for the greatest benefit to the largest number of Canadians over the longest possible time. This is, in fact, the very foundation of Roosevelt conservationism. And even a cursory review of Canadian history tells you that we owe much of our prosperity to our ability to develop our resources in a timely and an intelligent fashion. And we should not abandon that heritage, and we should not risk our future. I worked in coal mines to put myself through university. There is no shame. There is no shame in the development of our natural resources as a country as long as we are the best in the world at it and as long as it is sustainable. And so as a nation, we will therefore continue to expand production in the oil sands. We will continue to develop our mineral wealth and our natural gas reserves. We will continue to build out the development of Canada's hydroelectricity. And in each of these cases, to those who disagree with us, we will point out that we are being responsible and farsighted. A second principle is that we must establish Canada as a world leader in the advancement of conservation and in the protection of the environment. As I've suggested, there are those who, often for the purposes of rhetoric and advocacy, attempt to portray resource development and environmental protection as competing interests. This is a false proposition. The more complicated and nuanced truth is that we can pursue both and we can achieve both. We can be a country that excels in the development of our natural resources and a country that excels in the protection of natural spaces and in environmental enhancement. We can lead in both. We always have. Indeed, I have said throughout my career that this is part of the genius of our country. We have a capability to do this, and we should continue to lead. Thirdly, and often overlooked, is this principle. We enjoy an extraordinary environmental advantage. We as Canadians are trustees of the most beautiful country in the world, and as North Americans, we enjoy an asset that enhances our competitiveness, and that is the environment. Canada has one of the world's cleanest electricity systems, emitting virtually no carbon, headed to a future in which we will emit no carbon whatsoever. And as a continent, spurred by the oil and gas revolution that we have seen, which I will speak more of in a few moments, North America has opened up a triple advantage over the rest of the world in terms of security, in terms of industrial competitiveness, but also in terms of the environment. And by comparison, what is the comparison? By comparison, on my most recent trip to Beijing, the smog was so thick that I could not see buildings across the street from where I was standing. And Dan Nowlan will tell you that it has become so difficult that the Canadian banks cannot recruit bankers who will move to Beijing. And it was so difficult last week that our staff who were there could not allow their children to leave their houses with pollution levels that were 10 times the allowable limits here in North America. And so all of this serves, my point is that all of this serves as a stark reminder on the dramatic advantage that we have been gifted by previous generations as North Americans, and the fact that our environmental standards help us stand out in a competitive world for recruiting investment, talent, and commerce. And so with that in mind, we must view the environment as a North American issue, because airsheds and watersheds don't respect provincial boundaries, they don't respect state boundaries, and they don't respect the Canada-US boundary. And so we must pursue harmonization with the United States. And I say to you that it is crucial that we as Canadians refrain from damaging our competitiveness by independently imposing costs, including environmental costs, on our domestic industries. We should not take unilateral action. We should work together with the United States where we can achieve even greater benefits for the environment, whether you speak of climate change or other environmental standards, and make our continent all the more competitive. Fourthly, I think it is important as a principle that as Conservatives, we will rely on free markets. We will rely on free markets to develop the technology that will assist in the pursuit of greater environmental responsibility. Over the past 5 years, the North American energy landscape has been radically transformed. Revolutionized is not too strong a term, by the surge in oil and gas production in Canada and the United States. This is a surge that has been driven by free markets and the adoption of technology by free markets. It is a surge that was not achieved because of the efforts of government. In fact, in the United States, it was achieved in spite of the governments. And we should remember that. The same ingenuity, the same determination can be harnessed to further achieve environmental progress. And we must avoid the lure of what I describe as subsidized environmentalism, the kinds of government-sponsored programs that funnel public money into what I will describe most kindly as efforts that have a dubious record of tangible success. As a nation, we poured billions of dollars into eco-subsidies without seeing absolutely any improvement in environmental outcomes. The Americans have done the same thing with ethanol. And in Europe, Europeans have spent billions and billions of dollars on renewable energy projects that have been singularly successful. Singularly successful in damaging their industrial competitiveness. And as for the environment, well, the Europeans are now madly burning US coal, which is the dirtiest of all choices. And meanwhile, the United States, which was pilloried at Copenhagen, along with other countries, is achieving significant reductions, the most significant reductions in the world, by switching from coal to natural gas, a path that has been made possible by free markets and the adoption of technology by those free markets. A fifth principle as Conservatives is that we must believe in, we must establish, and we must enforce world-class regulatory and monitoring standards. I remember speaking for the first time when I met the Environment Canada officials when I arrived as their newly minted minister. I told them that their goal would henceforth be to be a world-class regulator and to adjust and adopt world standards. I don't think they had ever heard that before. That doesn't mean that they are there to block development. It doesn't mean that they are there to get to know. But any country's environmental ambition can only be as good as the people and the systems that regulate it. And so we must continue to define an environmental protection regime that is fair, that is clear, that is well thought out, and that is well enforced. And in that sense, as Conservatives, we must encourage individual responsibility and corporate responsibility by adhering to the principle of polluter pay. And we must ensure that our regulators adhere to the imperative of investor certainty and the need to conduct reviews that are thorough yet timely. Because as Roosevelt himself noted, delay is costly. 9/10 of wisdom. 9/10 of wisdom consists of being wise in time. Peter Sellers maybe said it another way when he said 9/10 of success was just showing up. And we will apply serious and meaningful sanctions against those who damage the environment with criminal neglect. As some of you may recall, it was during my time as Environment Minister that some 1,600 ducks perished in a tailings pond in the oil sands because people didn't do what they were supposed to do. and the company was judged to be responsible, and the resulting sanction came in the form of the largest fine in Canadian history for an environmental offense. And so the regulations of which I speak must be smart, they must be sound, they must be forward-looking, but they also have to have teeth and consequences. And for those who doubt the efficacy of what I'm describing, who doubt the efficacy of this approach, those who doubt the potential for our free markets to innovate, to adopt technology within a framework of sensible public regulation, you only need to turn your attention to the auto industry to see what is happening there, which is today achieving a remarkable transformation in terms of fuel economy, reduced carbon emissions, because they have been compelled to meet North American targets. They have been left to their own devices as to how they get there, but they have been compelled to meet targets. A week or two ago, I was at the Ford headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan. I'm a Ford guy, I'm a truck guy. And they revealed at that time the new Ford F-150 pickup truck. The Ford F-150 has been the perennial bestseller of pickup trucks in North America for as long as people have been keeping records. The new truck, inspired by these regulations, will be 700 pounds lighter than its predecessor. It will be constructed from military-grade aluminum. It will be competitive. It will have smaller engines. It will be more fuel efficient. It will emit more carbon. And the regulations that drove that innovation were agreed upon by Secretary Chu and myself and with the Prime Minister and President Obama as harmonized North American regulations. And so they are producing now major improvements in fuel economy, and they are representative of the kind of change that we need to see with smart, forward-looking regulations. And another illustration of that, my friends, is coal. Because instead of paying consumers to buy green energy or paying industrialists to build windmills, the government has changed the regulatory framework to mandate that when existing coal plants reach the end of their useful life, they must be replaced by plants that achieve modern standards equating to the burning of natural gas. And so those dirty plants are replaced with cleaner forms of energy. This is the very embodiment of the sound regulations of which I speak. This was adopted firstly by us as Canada, and everything you read in the United States about what they are doing to deal with their emissions entails adopting the same policy that Canada already has. A sixth principle I think that is sometimes overlooked is that we must enlist science. We must enlist science and technology as our allies in responsible development. We would not today be enjoying the economic benefits that we are seeing in North America, the reindustrialization, the reshoring of jobs, were it not for the assiduous application of science. And for us as Canadians, it should never be forgotten that the development of the Canadian oil sands is one of this country's greatest scientific achievements. And so we need to embrace science and technology, not only to understand the ongoing and emerging challenges to our environment, but we need to embrace them as an integral component of the ultimate solutions. And if we lead as conservatives, industry will follow. And an illustration of that is what's happening today in the oil sands, where some of the world's largest energy companies, some of the world's fiercest competitors, have waived their intellectual and property rights so that they can work together, collectively reducing their industry's impact in terms of effect on water, in terms of resource utilization, climate, and agriculture. A seventh principle is that as conservatives, we must continue to lead the world in conservation and into the protection of natural spaces. And in the past life, I was for a time the minister responsible for Parks Canada. And I remember one of the first meetings I had with the officials in the department. And I reminded them that their duty was to save Canada's national parks for Canadians, not from Canadians. Because we have the good fortune to enjoy the world's most extraordinary tapestry of national parks and protected areas. And this is sometimes lost, but and I acknowledge Minister Strahl, who is here, for his leadership on this, Minister Baird. But over the 2 years that we worked together when I was the minister responsible for Parks Canada, with the active support of Prime Minister Harper, we expanded Canada's national parks by 1/3. A new park in the Torngat Mountains in Labrador, new park initiated in the Mealy Mountains in Newfoundland, a 5-fold expansion of the Nahanni National Park in the Northwest Territories, the addition of Sable Island as our newest park, the creation of the Guayhanas Marine Conservation Park, the very first time in the world that an ecosystem has been protected from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the mountains. They said that it couldn't be done because people couldn't reach an agreement with the Haida. And the people I've described managed to do that. And you know, the expansion of the Nahanni in particular was recognized internationally as the most significant conservation achievement on the planet in a generation. Not doubled or tripled or quadrupled, 5 times larger than its original size. And so these are accomplishments that will endure as a Conservative legacy for all time. Because over a 24-month, as Conservatives, we set aside an area of land larger than Belgium as national parks. And it must be said that when we arrived at the International Climate Change table, we received absolutely no credit for doing any of that. Which brings me to my 8th and final principle. As Conservatives, we must build domestic and international partnerships and alliances, and we must constructively engage with the world in pursuit of environmental solutions and progress, including on climate change. You know, here at home, first of all, we have to work more constructively with our First Nations and our Indigenous peoples to build economic partnerships that are founded on sound environmental principles. And it should surprise no one. It should surprise no one that Canada's Indigenous peoples, who have been here the longest and who live most closely to the natural environment, have strong views on these issues. And we need to listen. And mark my words, there will be no pipelines to the West Coast, there will be no exports of Canada's oil from the West Coast, nor LNG terminals on the West Coast, unless we strike meaningful economic partnerships with First Nations. And all of this brings you really to this simple fact of the matter. If you are in the energy business today, then you are in the environment business today. They are flipped. They are two sides of the same coin, and if we are serious about being a global superpower in terms of energy, we are going to have to be a global power in terms of protecting and advancing the environmental discussion. And we need to be willing to work in good faith with people that agree with us and people who don't agree with us. And I would say to you, as someone who represented Canada at the Copenhagen Summit, I can say from hard experience that we can never again allow ourselves as a country to be off-footed, to be caught in a circumstance where we are following rather than leading. And so I say to you, my friends, that these are 8 principles that allow us as Conservatives to take back the environmental debate. These are the principles that should guide us in the service both of today's Canadians, the young people who are represented in this room, and as Roosevelt said, the people unborn. And by way of conclusion, I would note that Roosevelt's views on conservation were shaped in no small part by the thinking of another Conservative, a Republican, a fellow by the name of Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the U.S. Forest Service, went on to become a Republican governor of Pennsylvania, as I recall. And he was the first to discern that proper, responsible management, protection of the environment, but proper, responsible management of a forest should yield more for the service of man. And Pinchot never aspired to lock away anyone's resources. Rather, he advocated the application of the same kind of common sense that we all apply to our personal affairs: moderation, responsibility, prudence, farsightedness, what we are going to leave to our children and our grandchildren. And I say to you that this is a philosophy that we should feel comfortable with as Conservatives. And it is one that we should have no hesitation to advocate and to defend and to enunciate. I describe myself as a passionate conservationist. I ascribe to the views of Emerson, who wrote long essays about the natural world, but whose guiding view, I think, can perhaps best be summed up in one of his shortest but most powerful sentences, when he said, "Nature is loved by what is best in all of us." None of this is new. All of this is conservative. And I note as I close with interest the words of Premier Ernest Manny in 1967 at the opening of the very first Canadian oil sands plant, when he observed that the purpose behind the development of Canada's natural resources is not money alone. It is, in fact, the advancement of our human resources and the creation of economic and social conditions which, and I quote, "in which free and creative men and women can best develop their individual talents, fulfill their hopes and aspirations, and make their personal dreams come true." And so I say in closing, we will develop our resources for the good of the present generation, and in so doing, we will protect and advance the public interest. We will strive to prevent waste and loss as an embodiment of our obligations to future generations. And we will do this as Conservatives, guided by the principles we believe in, mindful always of the trust that we have to future Canadians. Thank you very much.